I've been shooting traditional archery for quite a while with a stick bow I'm very proud of because I made it. The quiver I've been using since forever is this one, and there are aspects of it I like. One thing I don't like is that it's some weird synthetic material. It doesn't feel very organic. It doesn't feel very fitting with the traditional archery that I'm doing. So I am going to launch into trying to make a leather quiver. Now, if you're watching this because you're looking for expert advice from a leather worker on how to work with leather and make a quiver, this ain't for you, because this is going to be my first experience working with leather. So I'm going to fumble through. There are going to be people out there who do stuff way better than I. However, I'm going to take you through my experience and what it takes for me to make a quiver. First thing I did is make a paper pattern, and I'm using rosin paper. You can get that on a roll from a home center for the pattern. It works great for this stuff. The dimensions of this pattern are based on the old quiver. Throwback to high school geometry, I used pi in order to change the diameter of the top of the quiver and the bottom of the quiver into how wide the paper pattern should be at that point. The old quiver was too short for my arrows, so this one is a little bit longer. And yes, it's tapered, wider at the top than the bottom. Now this half round collar, that is there in order to stiffen up the top of the quiver. I thought if the leather just ended, it would be kind of floppy and then hard to put my arrows into. So I wanted to introduce what's basically a hem to stiffen up the top of the quiver. This allowance I left on the long edges is 3/8 of an inch wide, and it's because when I'm done, I want to saddle stitch the faces together in order to close the quiver. Binder clips work great for this, and I'll end up using them again later when I stitch the quiver. It looks like I'm getting what I want out of this. Proof, of course, is in the pudding, or the arrows. That is gonna work. I've had this cowhide forever. I bought it from a boot company. It was a second for them. It's certainly not for me. It's about a 5-ounce leather. And next thing is to figure out where on this expansive hide I want the quiver to go. There are various marks on the leather. Do I want to incorporate them? Do I want to avoid them? And yes, I turned that paper pattern into a 1/4 inch thick plywood pattern so that it would be easier to trace as I'm cutting around it. There's just a little bit of the scar in the leather right there, and I kind of like that. So this is the chunk I'm going to use. A self-healing cutting mat is a great solution for cutting on my bench without cutting into my bench. I'm cutting the leather with a leather-specific knife, and honestly, if I did this again tomorrow, I would just use a utility knife instead of this knife. It would make this a lot easier. Lesson learned since I did this project. Cutting around this curve was by far the hardest part of this cutting process. People are screaming at their computers right now saying, there's a better way, and I agree. A utility knife would have made this a lot easier to do. Next thing I'm going to do is mark out where I need the fold to go in order to create these flats that I'm going to stitch through later. I heated up my edge scriber so that it leaves this cool dark line right on the fold line. Next thing is to mark out where the stitching will go. I'm positioning a straight edge halfway between the fold line and the edge of the leather, and then using a scratch awl to make a line. Same process across the bottom. I'm getting ready for stitching by pre-punching all the holes for the needle. I'm using a 6-tine stitching fork and punching that through the leather. I've got a sacrificial piece of plywood underneath, so I'm punching into that when I go through, not into my bench. The way this works is you punch 6 and then tine number 1 goes in hole number 6. That's what's keeping the pattern equally spaced as you work your way up the edge. On a long straight edge like this, use a punch with a lot of tines in it. If you're working your way around a curve, you're going to have to probably use one with fewer tines so you can navigate the curve. Same process across the bottom and up the other side. Because I own a laser, I thought it'd be cool to personalize my quiver. It took a little bit of messing around with the settings. Normally this laser is used for wood that I work with, so I had to back the settings off to get just the right look on the leather. Do some practicing before you do the real piece. There are a few things going on with the edges. First thing I'm doing is running a beveler, which just does a nice job of taking the sharp corner off the leather and gives it a little nicer look, a little nicer feel. I did this on the straight edges, no need to do it on the rounded edge because that's getting flipped over. Next thing here is I'm ready to burnish the edges. I'm putting just a little bit of water on the edge. You want it to be damp, but not dripping wet. It's a really great idea to practice this on scrap leather before you do it on your project. Next step is to get going with the burnisher itself. This is just a stick of hardwood that's got a bunch of round bottom grooves in it. Use the groove size that matches your leather thickness the best. And by simply rubbing back and forth, friction is burnishing that edge, leaving it smoother and slightly rounded. On the straight edges, I'm going with this other style of burnisher. I find this burnisher easier to use than the one I used in the previous step. At the end of the day, the whole thing is still a little awkward for me. You're pushing down with the burnisher to put pressure on the leather. The leather is flexible, so it's flexing away from the pressure. There's a happy marriage here that I'm not that great at yet. I need to practice this a lot more to get better at it. Now I'm using edge coat, and this is available in a variety of different colors. So I'm putting black edge coat on here, and yes, that's a pencil. I've tried daubers, I've tried Q-tips, I've tried a couple different application methods, and I found that if I get a little bit of edge coat on the tapered tip of the pencil, I can apply it to the edge without it ending up running over the faces of the leather and ending up in a big mess all over the place. I really like the way the edge coat finishes the raw edge of the leather, and as you're doing this, remember we've rounded the edge. So you've got to work that pencil or whatever your applicator is back and forth a little bit to get the entire edge covered. This half round is going to get folded over and act like a collar around the top of the quiver. To make that happen, I marked out the position of the fold with a scratch awl. Now I'm using a V cutter to relieve the face of the leather just a little bit. It's that relief that's going to allow the leather to completely fold on itself. Because I started about a ½ inch in from the opposite edge, I got to come back and finish the V here. Getting some water down into that V cut I just made and onto the opposing face to encourage the leather to want to make the fold. Now that it's made the fold, I want to encourage it to keep the fold, so I'm basically making a vise out of scrap wood and a couple of clamps to hold the leather in place. I allowed this to sit overnight. Bottom line, we want the leather to get pretty dry in order to give it the opportunity to hold that shape. Similar process, I need to create a fold along these long edges that'll allow me to fold up those 3/8 flanges where I'm going to stitch the quiver closed. Because I'm not folding the leather back on itself, I'm really just creating a 90-degree bend. I didn't have to do the V-cut on this one. Here's my approach, and I absolutely believe it if you say there's a better way to do this. I'm using a 2x2 with good sharp corners on it and positioning the corners right on the line that I created a few steps ago with the edge scriber. And get that clamped firmly to the bench. Then I'm going to bring another 2x2 in behind the leather and squeeze that with clamps up against the first 2x2, hopefully thereby creating a fold. Another overnight sit and the clamps and the blocks can come off. Without this step, the quiver would have ended up sort of egg-shaped instead of round when I stitched the two faces together. Binder clips for the win again. What I'm doing here, this is final proof of concept, making sure that when I get this whole thing stitched together, it's going to give me what I want. Of course, if it doesn't at this point, I'm in big trouble. I'm going to use a saddle stitch on this, so what I'm doing here is 2 needles on thread, and I'm spitballing how much thread I need so that I can get all the way up the length of the quiver without running out of thread. End of the day, it's over twice as much thread as the quiver is long. Make sense? I took the binder clips back off except for this one because I need enough freedom of movement to make sure the holes are aligned. And I didn't have that with all the binder clips on. With an awl in the very first hole, I've got the 2 holes aligned, pulling the needle and thread through, and now I should have good alignment from here on out, but with only 1 clip on there, I can wiggle stuff around as I go. And now needle number 1 in my right hand goes my right to left through hole number 2. And with that needle still in the hole, needle number 2 in my left hand goes my left to right, also through hole number 2. And then pull that tight. And from here, there is a whole bunch of rinse and repeat. Keep your awl nearby if the fork we used earlier didn't go all the way through or the hole isn't quite clean. You might have to use the awl to open the holes up a little bit so the needles will penetrate. I found it easiest to put 1 needle in the hole and while it's still in the hole, push the second needle through. I need a way to hang the quiver from my belt. So the next thing is I'm stitching in right into the seam here, some 3/4 inch strips, and that's gonna allow me to create that hanger. Just like on the quiver itself, I've already got holes punched through the strips, but this is all just a little funky and a little awkward. This is where, knowing what I know now, a leather stitching pony would have been a big help to hold everything in place as I'm doing the stitching. Well, I finally got to the end. I backstitched, I knotted it, and the sewing is finally done. The hanger straps are stitched into the quiver, but the binder clips are holding them in a tentative spot while I get their length just right. Once I knew what that length needed to be, same protocol, I pre-punched all the holes and then I saddle stitched these straps surrounding that ring. Overall, it's a really simple concept. I'll put a hook through the ring, and then that hook can either go on the corner of my pocket or on my belt. I cut a round bottom for the quiver, same diameter as the quiver itself, and now I'm using a 2-tine punch in order to pre-punch for stitches. This is one of these occasions where a narrower punch has to be used in order to navigate the curve. In order to connect the bottom to the quiver, I'm going to use a whip stitch. I'm really happy with how the quiver came out, and as with any process you do for the very first time, right away there were a bunch of things that in retrospect I would do differently, but that's okay. That's part of the learning experience. I like the way that it hangs on my belt. I like the way the arrows feed out of it, and I love the fact that I now have this more traditional organic quiver that I made to go with the bow I made. As you can see, it didn't necessarily make me any better shot. But I really enjoyed the process of making the quiver, and honestly, I can't wait to jump into another leather making project.